Hello, everyone, and welcome to our next study in A Journey Through the Bible by Lamar Vest. Today, we are going to be looking at the next genre of biblical books, which are the historical books. And that's going to take us from Joshua all the way through to Esther. So, the Bible, as we know, is not a collection of disconnected stories or events. It is all connected, not only just through the life of Jesus and the prophecies concerning him, but through the actual people themselves. And we see that a lot of the people that the Bible follows are people in the lineage of Christ or people integral to the nation of Israel. And so, in understanding God's master plan for creation and the plan that he has for us, we have to understand that there is a progressive revelation of his will and of his word. God spoke to people in history just like he speaks to us today. And so he speaks to people through realizing the history, just like he spoke to people through realizing the law that we just talked about. And so we are understanding that God has created everything because it is part of his plan for his master of creation. And a key part of that is memory and recording history. Society and culture are built upon their histories, and without having a memory of their histories, they're likely to be destroyed, and likely to be destroyed by the same mistakes that other societies that have been destroyed, their ancestors have made. There's a quote from a Holocaust survivor, Elie Wiesel, that said, "Without memory, there is no culture. Without memory, there would be no civilization, no society, no future." In the book of Hebrews, a little bit later in the Bible, we'll see that it says we must pay close attention to what we have heard. And that's hearing from God as well as hearing from our own past. Ancient Israel, however, much like much of society today, seem to have remembered a lot of what should have been forgotten and forgotten a lot of what should have been remembered. And so it made navigating, moral, like life difficult for them. So we're going to look through the historical books today, and a lot of the actions of the people of Israel are not only reminiscent of people today, but they're going to seem cyclical. Like the people of Israel were constantly making the same mistakes, they were constantly making the same actions. And that's, I think, just a key of human nature that we're going to realize today. The historical books cover about 800 years of history of Israel and Judah. We're going to pick up where we left off with Moses' death and the people of Israel going into the promised land, and we'll go all the way through to where they return from exile. So it's a great deal of stuff to study. I'm not sure if we'll get it all finished or if we'll have to split this in half like we did with the Pentateuch, but we shall see. So the major events that we're going to start through the historical books, we're going to start with the death of Moses and go into the leadership of Joshua. From there, in the life of Joshua, we'll see the people conquering the land of Canaan, which was the land that God promised to them. Then we're going to enter the period of the judges and that leadership, the establishment of the kings of Israel, the division of Israel, splitting into both Israel and Judah, the fall of both kingdoms, and then the return from exile to Jerusalem. We're going to hit all of those points with all of these books. I also want to make a comment. Calling these books historical books does not mean that the actions found in the remainder of the Bible are not historically true. It's just saying that the genre of these books are historical narratives and that they are mostly concerned with reporting historical narratives. Whereas the first 5 books of the Bible, while they contained historical narrative, they were more focused on portraying the law. The next section we're going to look at of poetry, there are events described there which are historically true, but it's more concerned with expressing human emotion. So calling these books historical does not mean that the other events found in the Bible are not historically accurate. It just means that the intent of these books was to convey history. So with that said, let's get into the preview of what we talked about previously. The final years of wilderness wandering. The Israelites spent 40 years wandering the wilderness after their escape of Egypt, wandering from camp to camp. And so they would sometimes stay for short periods of times at some locations, and then other times they would spend a very long amount of time at a certain camp. And often finds they found themselves circling back and coming to the same places that they had stayed at before. But they were always on the move towards the land of promise. And they experienced lots of supernatural events. As they were leaving Egypt, they saw the parting of the Red Sea and the drowning of Pharaoh's army. God provided lots of miracles for them. He provided food as manna from heaven and water come from rocks twice. They had a pillar of cloud by day to lead them, a pillar of fire by night. Moses received the law from God, and there were great supernatural events happening there. And their clothes and sandals that they had did not wear out for 40 years. So God was actively moving despite the fact that they were being punished to not enter the land of promise. And in spite of all of these mighty miracles, it doesn't appear that the relationship the children of Israel had with God improves during this time. Instead of marching towards the promised land, they were marching towards death. Only Joshua and Caleb were they were the only adults to enter into the land of Canaan. The rest of that generation died off, and it was the next generation that received the promise. It was because of the disobedience of the children of Israel and the disobedience of Moses himself that they didn't get to enter the promised land. And so Moses asked God to appoint another man to lead the Israelites, and God chooses Joshua, who had been a warrior and a helper to Moses, and one of the only two men that had confidence in God from that generation. And so we pick up after the law with the book of Joshua. And this is when we see God fulfill his promise of the Israelites entering into the land of promise. And so I'm going to read a key verse from a lot of the books that we talk about today. And this one is Joshua 1:9, God speaking to Joshua when he's calling him into leadership. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and of good courage. Do not be afraid, nor be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. So this book was written, we don't really know who, according to the Bible. It doesn't attribute an author like the Torah does. But Jewish tradition says it was probably Samuel that wrote this, but could have been anyone. We don't really know for sure. And the events of the book of Joshua, it covers about a 30-year span, and it takes place from 1406 BC to 1376 BC. Joshua's name means Yahweh saves, and it's actually the same derivation of the name Jesus. And so Joshua led the children of Israel into the promised land. The Israelites entered the land of Canaan as this warring tribe, and they were commissioned by God to subdue the land and destroy all of the false idols. There were people living in the land of Canaan, and these people did not worship God. They were worshiping all sorts of pagan deities, and God was sending Israel into the land of promise as much as it was fulfilling his promise to Abraham and all of the people of Israel. It was also punitive for the people that were currently living in the land, the people that were practicing child sacrifices. They were practicing abysmal rituals of worship. And so God was using the children of Israel to punish and clear out these sinful people. And so the idea that God had here was to create this holy nation that worshiped him, the one true God, and so that the rest of the world could see worship to God. The whole idea of the people of Israel was to be a nation of priests, a royal priesthood. Before they could get into the land of Canaan, they had to cross the Jordan River, and this was a major obstacle. You've got an entire nation of people, and here's a river. There's no bridge. They don't have boats. And so what happened was God created a miracle. As soon as the priest carrying the Ark of the Covenant stepped into the waters of the Jordan, the river stopped and rose up in a heap, just like when they crossed the Red Sea. And so these Israelites, they were likely children when they crossed the Red Sea. It's been 40 years. They're adults now, and they're seeing the same miracle. God work in the same way for them that he worked in for their parents. And so they packed up their belongings, and these people are believing in God. They follow into the land of promise, and they are ready to face the challenges that come to them. One of the first challenges that they face is the walled city of Jericho. This is a people that has been wandering for 40 years in the wilderness. We don't know how organized their military would have been, but God didn't pick the children of Israel because they were the greatest of warriors. He picked them because he knew that he could show his glory and might through them. So God commands the children of Israel to walk around the city of Jericho for 6 days, blowing or carrying trumpets made from ram's horns. On the 7th day, they walked around 7 times, and on the 7th time, they blew the trumpets and shouted with a loud voice, and the walls came tumbling down, and they came in and took over the city. And they were commanded then to take over the rest of the land of Canaan. Following the death of Joshua, this leader, we then enter a very dark period of Israel's history, known as the period of the Judges. And the verse that we're going to read from Judges is not nearly as happy as the verse from Joshua. Judges 21:25 says, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes." And the book of Judges is definitely that cyclical motion that I was talking about earlier. We see these cycles of victories and failures with the people of Israel. Again, we don't really know who the author is. Jewish tradition says Samuel. We don't know. May have been, may not have been. I'm not going to stick a dog in that fight. This period takes place from 1375 BC to 1075 BC. So about a 300-year period covered in the book of Judges. And it lists 12 different judges that rule Israel here. The best known are probably Deborah, Gideon, and Samson. You've heard Sunday school stories about them, I guarantee. But the majority of these judges were not upstanding moral leaders. The successes that the judges had were not due to their own righteousness or their own acts of following God or their own intelligent actions, but because they were aided by the grace of God, because it was God that intervened on behalf of his people. The word judge is a bit misleading, and I do find it strange that in modern Bible translations it's not been updated, but it doesn't signify what we think of as a judge, someone presiding over cases and ruling whether something is according to the law or not. They were much more like military leaders and deliverers for the people of Israel. The judges oftentimes were acting in a heroic sense. They were leading armies. They were committing assassinations. Was what they did. That was their rules. And so we see this cyclical pattern throughout the book. The people turn away from God and have this apostasy. They're disobedient. And then there are some consequences. They are ruled over by another nation, and the people are miserable. And eventually they cry out to God and repent, and that is when God raises up a judge to deliver them. And after they have deliverance and they get peace for a little while, they return again to apostasy and idol worship. There's no objective authority of God in their lives. They don't appear to have any personal connection with God or desire to do right because of a desire to love and serve him. In the verse that I read earlier, it says that everyone did what was right in their own sight, which means they're not trying to do wrong. They're not intentionally being evil. They're doing wrong because that's what's natural. They're doing wrong because that is what seems rational in their own mind. They're not pursuing what God has said is right. They're following their own whims. And so in Judges, we see what happens when people are left to their own devices. I'm going to read a passage from Judges 2 now. This is verse 16 through 19. Nevertheless, the Lord raised up judges who delivered them out of the hand of those who plundered them. Yet they would not listen to their judges, but they played the harlot with other gods and bowed down to them. They turned quickly from the way in which their fathers walked. In obeying the commandments of the Lord, they did not do so. And when the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge and delivered them out of the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved to pity by their groaning because of those who oppressed them and harassed them. And it came to pass when the judge was dead that they reverted and behaved more corruptly than their fathers by following other gods to serve them and bow down to them. They did not cease from their own doings or from their stubborn ways. The Israelites had been commanded during the days of Joshua to drive out the Canaanites and establish worship of only Yahweh, of only the one true God. But instead, they left some of the Canaanites. So they didn't listen to God originally, and they adopted the same abominable worship practices that the people that were living in the land had. And so we see that when you tolerate what God has commanded you to drive out, then it changes your own heart. And soon you and the generations coming after you are doing what God abhors. And we can see that in our land today. It's a very clear parallel that as we tolerate more and more immorality in our land, that more and more Christians and people who had been raised in church or where their parents had been raised in church begin to act in the same manner. The culture is large. So Judges is a very, very sad book where we see the revelation of what the human heart is like without God changing and truly ruling in your heart. Then we move to a bit of a happier story of Ruth. I didn't update this slide. Oh no, that's terrible. That's okay. That's funny. Ruth was rescued by her kinsman redeemer, and I'm going to read Ruth 1:1. Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem of Judah went to dwell in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. So there's our setup. We're in the time of the judges. And then in Ruth chapter 1, verse 16, but Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God." So the book of Ruth occurs during this miserably dark time of the judges, but it is this captivating narrative in Israel's history, and it's incredibly historically important. So the narrative opens with the fact that Ruth, the character we're going to follow and who it is named after, is a foreigner. She's not of the people of Israel. She's living in her home in Moab, and the Moabites were historically regarded as an enemy of the people of Israel. And so we hear that there's a famine in the land of Israel, in Bethlehem, that prompted Elimelech to take his wife Naomi and their 2 sons into the land of Moab in search of food. And while they're there, they settle down and get married. And so Elimelech and his 2 sons die, leaving 3 widows, Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah. Naomi decides to return back to Bethlehem with her daughters-in-law. Orpah goes to turn home back to Moab to try to find a new husband to be able to have children. Ruth, who is childless, she doesn't have an heir. She decides to go with Naomi. She loves her mother-in-law. She feels dedicated to her, and she returns with her. When she makes her way back to Israel, she finds a man named Boaz, who is her kinsman redeemer. And that's an idea that the next in line of the family would be able to take on a childless wife and continue the family lineage there. And so this status that Boaz has as kinsman redeemer is a foreshadow of Jesus Christ, who is going to redeem us as his bride. That's what the church's relationship is to Jesus. And Ruth is important because she's one of the very few women mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus when we see that listed in the New Testament. Women were not ordinarily included in genealogies, and it's especially important because Ruth was a foreign woman. She was not of the land of Israel. And yet God specifically wanted to write her into his story regarding his plan for salvation. And so Gentiles being included in the plan of salvation is not an afterthought. It wasn't after Jesus died, God went, "Oh, well, yeah, I guess we'll include the Gentiles into my family." No, Gentiles had been on his mind from the beginning, which is just remarkable for us to think of that don't have Jewish heritage. So Ruth provides this wonderful contrast to the darkness of the book of Judges because we see beauty in the love story of Ruth and Boaz. And it provides a bridge between the time of the judges and the time when Israel is given to a king. And it also gives us this look of what it means for Jesus to be our redeemer, our kinsman redeemer, and for us to be his bride. So Next thing we're going to look at is we're going to group the books, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and rather viewing them as books on their own, we're going to view the story that they tell together, because they do tell this overarching historical narrative of the time of the kings. So we're going to talk about authorship here. 1st and 2nd Samuel, perhaps authored by Samuel. Samuel does die partway through it, so it could have been he authored the first part, someone else picked it up. Could have been a completely different person just writing the history. We don't really know. We do know that it takes place from 1105 to 770 or 971 BC. 1st and 2nd Kings, again, don't know the author. Could have been Ezra, Ezekiel, or Jeremiah. Those are often things that are passed down from Jewish tradition. We don't know. The events in 1st and 2nd Kings take place from 970 to 586 BC. And then 1st and 2nd Chronicles is a recap. It's a retelling of all of the events from 1st Samuel to 2nd Kings. Again, we don't know the author. They say the writing style is very similar to the writing of Ezra, so perhaps he would have been the chronicler here, or it could have been just some other person that we don't know about. So it, like I said, it spans the entire time of 1st and 2nd Samuel to 1st and 2nd Kings. So it goes from 1103 to 609 BC. So the first era we're going to talk about is the expanse of a nation, how Israel goes into an actual nation. 1 Samuel 8, 6 through 7 says, "But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, 'Give us a king to judge us.' So Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, 'Heed the voice of the people and all they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them.'" And so in our translation of the Bible that we see 6 books titled 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And originally in the Hebrew, the Samuel books were together, the Kings books were together, and the Chronicles books were together. And they cover approximately 500 years of Israel's history, beginning with the birth of Samuel, and it culminates in the destruction of Jerusalem and the return from exile. And it focuses mostly on the actions of kings and the action of prophets during this time. First, Samuel opens with an intriguing drama, and we are introduced some important people here. Hannah is praying for a son. Eli is the current high priest and judge of Israel, and we see her son Samuel, who is born. When Hannah's son is born, she dedicates him in service to Eli, and he lives with Eli at the tabernacle at Shiloh. And Samuel faithfully serves God, and he becomes one of the most revered prophets in Israel. And he is the prophet and judge that spans the time where the judges transitions to the time of the kings. He is an interesting figure in history because he is a prophet, and he is the last judge of that time period. And so the people decide that they want to have a king like all of the other nations around them. And Samuel warns against this, and God speaks to him, like we had read at the beginning of this section, that he is to follow the wills of the people, that the people aren't rejecting Samuel, they're rejecting God as their king. And so they decide to get a king, and Saul is chosen and anointed king by Samuel. And we see that in 1 Samuel chapters 9 and 10. And then God instructs Samuel to also anoint the next king before his death. Samuel travels to the small town of Bethlehem, to the house of Jesse, who had fathered at least 8 sons. David was the youngest of those sons. He was not even brought out to Samuel to see if he would have been selected to be king. He was a young shepherd, and despite appearances, despite age, he was the one that was chosen to be anointed as the next king of Israel. And although God had chosen him and he had been anointed to be the next king, his reign did not begin until after the death of Saul. And so this time that he has here between his anointing and his reign gives him lots of time to prepare to be the spiritual, political, and military leader of the nation of Israel. So The most famous story that we know of David is his defeating of the Philistine giant Goliath, and he served in Saul's army. He was blessed by God and he was adored by all the people. But when Saul, who is the king, sees the popularity of David, he becomes insanely jealous and he seeks many opportunities to kill him. Uh, and yet, by the grace of God, David escapes every attempt made against his life. And despite having opportunities to kill Saul and rightfully take his place as king, David chooses not to because Saul is king and he respects the authority that Saul has. And David, if you have not read the life of David, you need to read the life of David. It is incredibly chaotic, and there is a lot going on, and there's a lot of personal and political tension going on between these two men. Saul was described as standing head and shoulders above the rest of his crowd. That was part of the reason why he was chosen to be king. He stood tall, but he fell so hard. We record his 1 Samuel 31 records his death while fighting Philistines. He was badly wounded by enemy arrows, and he instructs his armor bearer to kill him with his sword, and his armor bearer refuses. And his pride instructed him or drove him to commit suicide rather than die at the hand of the enemy. Saul took his own sword and he fell on it, and he died in that battle along with his 3 sons. The Philistines then moved into some of the towns left by the Israelites. And then David takes over, and there's again lots of political tension during the reign of David. They enjoy some time of prosperity under his leadership, and he becomes one of the most admired kings of Israel. And he reigned over Israel, subduing his enemies. He was a man of war, and he was king for about 40 years. But he had a series of bad choices that resulted in a sin spiral that brought some great hardship and heartbreak to his family. And then he is succeeded by his son Solomon, who would then build the temple to God. And so the next section we're going to look at is the kingdom of Israel being divided. So Solomon was the next king. Israel had 3 kings where they were united as one nation, and it all went downhill from there. Solomon appoints a man named Jeroboam as head of his workforce for his building enterprises. Not only did Solomon build the temple to God, he also built a palace for himself and temples to a great many other gods. And so Jeroboam is told by a prophet named Ahijah that he will soon be king of the 10 northern tribes of Israel. Solomon catches wind of this, and he attempts to kill Jeroboam, and so Jeroboam flees to Egypt. So the kingdom that Solomon inherited was incredibly unstable because the northern kingdom is threatening to rebel because of the high taxes that have been placed on them based on all of the building projects that Solomon is doing. And so when Solomon ends his reign, his son Rehoboam takes the throne, and he has inherited a very chaotic kingdom. Rehoboam is the son of Solomon and the legal heir to a throne of a united Israel. After hearing the demands of the northern tribes that they would have their taxes lowered, that they would have a bit of a break, Rehoboam rejects their commands, refuses to listen to the counselors of his father Solomon, and threatens even more taxation. And this causes major division between the 10 tribes of the northern tribes and the 2 southern tribes of Israel. Rehoboam is chosen to reign as king of those 10 northern tribes, and the 2 southern tribes remain loyal to the lineage of David, Judah, and Benjamin, and they have Rehoboam as their king. Shechem becomes the capital of the northern nation, which is now referred to as Israel, and Jerusalem remains the capital of Judah. And Judah is what we hear. Judah is what is reigned by the lineage of David, and none of the kings of Israel are blood related to David. So after 200 years of existence as a nation, the 10 northern tribes of Israel were conquered by the Assyrians and taken captive in 722 BC. And then the conquest of Judah and its capital city, Jerusalem, was accomplished by 3 distinct invasions by the Babylonians, and that was covered by a period from 607 to the final invasion at 556 BC. The reason that the northern kingdom of Israel and then the southern kingdom of Judah fell was because of that cycle of idolatry that the people kept following. The people of Israel and the people of Judah kept serving the Baals and the Ashtoreths and the gods of the nations of Canaan that they should have thrown out way back in the time of Joshua. And because of the disobedience of their ancestors, that led to a cycle of behavior that even the people of Israel and the people of Judah kept following these false gods. There are some welcome interruptions in the misdeeds of all of the kings of Israel by an introduction to some of the greatest prophets in the Bible. We see Elijah and Elisha. They are probably the most preached about prophets in the Bible, and the relationship between those 2 prophets is one of the greatest stories in the Bible, even though it occupies just a little small part of the text. So Elijah was a prophet in Israel, and the message regarding their relationships is often missed. So we assume that in a mentoring relationship, a lot of times the younger person or the person with less experience is seeking out someone to help them and guide them. But in the case of Elijah, this role is reversed. Elijah pursued Elisha and called him to follow him and serve with him. And so this is something that we can take as Christians, that we should be seeking out and looking for people to mentor and people to bring about and to help bring it into the ministry. So the prophet Elijah had a great many miracles that God used through him. And I'm going to go over several of those. The first one is that early in his tenure in the Bible, this is the first instance we hear of him, is him praying and causing a drought in the land of Israel. God caused this drought, shut up the heavens, and the rain stopped coming. And then Elijah was called to move to different places, and God multiplied flour and oil for a widow. This is in 1 Kings chapter 17. And then God raised that widow's son to life. In the next chapter of the Bible, 1 Kings 18, we see that the prophets of Baal are defeated with fire from heaven during that great standoff. Choose this day whom you shall serve. And then shortly after that, we see that the rain came and ended the drought that had been caused. He destroyed 51 soldiers with fire and lightning, and then another 51 soldiers with fire and lightning when soldiers from Jezebel were coming to arrest him due to the destruction of the prophets of Baal. And then towards the end of his ministry, we see that he parts the waters of the Jordan River. And then Elisha does even more miracles in his tenure as prophet of Israel. The next couple of books we're going to look at are Ezra and Nehemiah, and this is a period of restoration and reconstruction after the Babylonian exile. So from the book of Ezra, chapter 1, verse 1 through 3. Years ago, the Lord sent Jeremiah with a message about a promise for the people of Israel. Then, in the first year that Cyrus was king of Persia, the Lord kept his promise by telling Cyrus to send this official message to all parts of the kingdom. I am King Cyrus of Persia. The Lord God of heaven, who is also the God of Israel, has made me the ruler of all nations of the earth. And he has chosen me to build a temple for him in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. The Lord God will watch over and encourage any of his people who want to go back to Jerusalem and help build the temple. So God did not banish the people of Israel for them to remain gone. In fact, he saw to it that the king of Persia would let them return to their land and rebuild the temple which had been destroyed. Nehemiah chapter 6, verse 3. This is Nehemiah saying, so I sent messengers to them saying, I am doing a great work so that I cannot come down. Why should the work cease while I leave and go down to you? So we see in Ezra and Nehemiah that God is making a way for his people to return. Some earliest manuscripts consider them to be a single book. Ezra was originally part of the remnant of Israel taken captive by the Babylonians. And when the Persians conquer Babylonia, Ezra finds favor with this king, and he's given his freedom and aid to return back to Jerusalem. He's a priest, he's a teacher, and he is a scribe. He organizes 40,000 Jews to return with him to the land of Israel. And when he returns, he sees that the community has broken down spiritually. And so early Jewish writers described the arrival of Ezra like the arrival of Moses coming back down from Sinai and destroying the golden calf. He would have been shocked seeing the state of Israel. The second person we see leading this restoration is Nehemiah. He was a cupbearer of the king. He received word from his brother Hanuni that the walls of Jerusalem had broken down and that its gate had burned. And so Nehemiah asks for and is granted permission to return to Jerusalem and rebuild these walls and protect his homeland. He's escorted by armed guards. He's got supplies. He's got letters from the king, and he goes back to work on the walls of the city. He's immediately met with opposition from the Ammonites. They're the neighboring governors, and they are concerned that Jerusalem would be fortified, and then the people of Israel would return to their land. And so in this inspiring speech to the Jews, Nehemiah informs them that the hand of God is upon them and convinces them to rebuild the wall. And the people work with sword and trowel to complete the task in 52 days. They rebuilt the walls around the entire city. So thanks to Nehemiah, Jerusalem now had a physical wall to protect them from physical attacks. Ezra then had to build up a spiritual wall for the people. And in fact, after the return from exile, the people of Israel did not fall back into that cyclical pattern of idolatry. They did not worship the Baals or the Ashtoreths again. In fact, they swung, as we see in the New Testament, they swung very far in the other way, and we see that they get very legalistic in the Pharisees and in the Sadducees in their devotion to God, that they take this very legalistic approach, and that's in response to the actions of their ancestors who fell into idolatry. So we did not get to Esther or some themes from the rest of the historical books, and so we'll cover that a little bit next time. Does anybody have any comments or questions so far on the historical books or the ones that we talked about?
It struck me about the importance of righteous leadership, that as Solomon gave into idolatry, then the whole nation gave into idolatry, and then you ended up there with Ezra, you know, as he leads that the people follow.
Mm-hmm.
Just what
Yeah.
Says.
Absolutely. And we see specifically with the nation of Judah, Israel has terrible kings the whole time, but that depending on how well the king was serving God, that was how well the people were serving God. And that's a very clear connection that the Bible makes there. Josiah being the greatest and most faithful servant to God that we see as a king. So yeah, leadership is definitely a very key role in how the people react. So any other comments? Thank you all for joining. I'll see you next week when we finish up the historical books. We'll probably go ahead and start poetry while we're there because we don't have much left of historical books. So thank you all.